Welcome to the AnteDote. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Rothgushel.
All right, Jeremy, we're back for dispatch number 4. It is Sunday, July the 27th, July 27th, 2025, and we're going to expand a little bit upon a train of thought that we were just discussing amongst ourselves, which is I think, the dialectics of elements of what could be called, resistance as far as resistance to certain projects, such as maybe the Zionist project and the Palestinian people, or even other projects as well. But we were specifically talking about this instance of the of you know the nature of maybe global terrorism going back to the 70s or even 60s and 70s, at least in the context of, I think, modern terrorism as it's as it's regarded in all of this, but then also tying it together to the more recent events of October 7th and this idea of legitimate resistance, and then coming in like maybe elements that are ostensibly advocating on behalf of the actual groups that are legitimately being targeted, obviously in major ways, and have a legitimate right to self-defense, and some of the dynamics around that. So we're just going to expand a little bit here upon a conversation that you and I have been having here, but I think it's a very important one, and it's one I think we can expand further upon out of this. And we've delved into these before, but I think right now, I'm putting a little bit more of a direct microscope on this in the amount of time that we talk here in this dispatch.
Yes, and in a way, I think it's part and parcel, especially in terms of like epistemological depths, and then like maybe the analysis of things, including what we've been going into in terms of Epstein Maxwell. That this question of of sort of composed synthetic dialectics that are then easily weaponized. So some people can get caught in traps. I think you get stuck, and other times they can actually be weaponized and turned into, you know, negative cultural strains, and even the backing of horrific deep political events. So, basic weaponized dialectics include, in terms of what Epstein Maxwell is Epstein, was it Clinton Epstein or was it Trump Epstein, right? And we saw the way that that played out over the last 10 years really intensely. Or the Democrats versus the Republicans, right? It's one of the reasons why, for a while now, I've been so committed to this idea, a combined idea of a politics of the radical middle, meaning that goes deep, goes to roots, so deep politics, and also going to the, focusing on truth and justice as a way of rooting out, some of the, not only the worst examples, right? Because in a certain way, the Epstein Maxwell network, as it becomes more and more publicly exposed and known about, is not only a very powerful example of the way that deep politics actually works, and leverage points, and the intersection between domestic deep politics and global deep politics or deep geopolitics, but it actually also really is the part of a key piece of the leverage points of deep politics. So this operates on multiple levels at the same time: an actionable level, a political actionable level, but also an epistemological and educational and learning kind of level. And my sense has always been that that phrase, it's a race between education and extinction. That was, one way of talking about it. And so I think that really understanding and sense making is crucial for all layers of life and politics. And they will a clarified understanding of our reality will have to be the basis of any kind of real politics moving forward here. And so in that strain, I think that, making our way through, it was Epstein Israeli, was or was Epstein CIA, Was Epstein Israeli or was Epstein Russia? These kinds of things, like they are, whenever you hear someone like trying to sort of just limit the scope and limit the hangout, they're either perpetrating weaponized dialectic intensely or they've fallen into the trap of it. And so I think, at least for this current moment, I think that unpacking the not only the conceptual framework of weaponized dialectics, but also the way that they actually function and continue to function on the ground is really important.
Yes, I agree. And so we were having this conversation about like the particularly as it relates, I think, to the nature of legitimate Palestinian resistance, and then some of the activities that I think or actions carried out, like as we've made the argument with October 7th, and even other events of terrorism by an entity that is, we're not really apparently it looks you look at like the kinds of connections that we've talked about and other people have delved into as far as the lead up to October 7th and some of the activities, say, of Hamas leadership, or even longer history. It looks like Netanyahu cultivating Hamas, or the preference of Hamas over maybe a more quote unquote legitimate kind of Palestinian representation in terms of a possible Palestinian state in the future. Which of course that's the constant justification for not having a Palestinian state is, or for not entertaining the possibility of it is, well, it's the people that they're hardliners, they won't work with us and all of this. But meanwhile, then it also seems like you can find the evidence or the details of where efforts as far as maybe other interests, imperfect interests, I would say, are also being potentially or being not as there's not as much of a preference for that, say, amongst like certainly like your hardline, your more Netanyahu types, and those even share his perspectives, and then those even harder than him of something other than like the Hamas entity is like having like this amount of influence within what would be the state and all this, and the constant justification for continuing things as well. They just can't. They just can't find leadership that's going to work with us and all of this. And so the dynamics of the legitimate resistance, and then around like an October 7th, where there are all these serious problems, like with the narrative and with even the nature, it seems like, of Hamas leadership and of the carrying out of the orchestration of an attack like this. And we had mentioned this, Jeremy, in terms of this idea of dialectics and legitimate resistance and all of this, that this idea, and you were talking about like you were just referencing to me Norman Finkelstein, or being interviewed by Brianna Joy Gray, that's her name, yeah, Brianna Joy Gray, and they're talking about oh well, we're concerned about Zoran Mamdani and his safety leading up to the New York mayoral election this November. But then, like, Brianna Joy Gray brings up the questions of, like, the 60s and all of this, and the Kennedy assassination, in particular Kennedy, and I guess it was the very Noam Chomsky-esque line of, well, it really doesn't matter and all of this. And it got me thinking about the way that events like that, like, there's the very well-known Malcolm X quote, at least attributed to him, of the chickens coming home to roost in the aftermath of the Kennedy assassination and all this. And then you've had that mentality for decades going on with and we've referenced this before, the aftermath of September 11th, where I think the most there was I think it was didn't Susan Sontag write about the evils that led up to September 11th and all that? A lot of people said that, like, oh, this is like a justification for this. That did happen, right? Am I remembering
Yes,
that correctly?
I think that's correct. Yeah.
And then years later, several years later, like in the later years of the Bush administration, it was this Colorado professor, Ward Churchill, who referred to the 9/11 victims as little Eichmanns, and of course that's more of an extreme example than the kind of people who just like than like your typical kind of blowback narratives, which of course takes the place of deep politics, actually trying to get to the bottom of this. But there is this element around like these dialectics and all of this, and it certainly figures in with September 11th, I think, to where people who may otherwise question more, and it might even be subconscious, like, well, this is, if we question this more, than like we're questioning like the the ability of people to legitimately fight back against the people who are oppressing you, who are killing your people, and all this. And then I think even more so, maybe even than 9/11, with there's still a legacy of how that has affected, I think, deep political inquiries into September 11th. But then with the aftermath of October 7th and Hamas, it's like, well, this is the Israeli chicken coming home to roost. And I had joked with you, Jeremy, like I don't think anybody's coined this, but you have the little Eichmanns, right, in the United States. Well, you have the little Menachem Begins in Israel, and it's like, hey, if they if the people the oppressed people rise up and kill 1,000 of you, and that's it's so you don't question these dynamics and these things because it's seen as the legitimate representation. So I think this is an important conversation to have, and I think it could also even I'm going to tie this in even domestically here at home, Jeremy, because we've got right now all this stuff going on with immigrants and ICE, and a very clearly coordinated effort to I think justify um, wholesale punishing a lot of people, even people in the name of like we're fighting the criminals and all of this. Like, and people know what's going on with that, I think, for the most part. But there is also this idea. There are also these things, and we joke sometimes about the Mecha alliance to describe like the all-encompassing conspiracy that brings together, global radical Islam and global communism and all of this. But there are even elements here domestically where I do think there are, at the very least, the framing sometimes among, say, maybe organized groups here in the United States of talking about like a militant, almost in militant terms of like taking back the American Southwest from the colonizers and making it a part of Mexico again. And I think I think this also happens here where there's almost a justification for like these crackdowns on people in the name of, well, this is that spirit of they're just here to recolonize and reconquer. So the hardworking man with the family who's trying to work and do anything in his power come to the United States and take care of his family and maybe try to help people in his family who are still in their home country, they become like part of this, whether it's knowing or not. They're in the spirit of like the people who want to militantly take back the land from the colonizers and all this. So I think there's a domestic and an international perspective to this, but it requires a lot of nuanced conversations about these matters that I don't think a lot of people on pretty much any side of the political and social spectrum are willing to have about these things. The nature of legitimate resistance, or the nature of um, legitimate protest, and then contrasting that with, well, when things happen against the and also there could very well be a case of like legitimate cases of maybe there were ICE officers or federal officers that were hurt in protests, but then it becomes like it gets tied in with like this, rather than maybe people who are frustrated and are trying to maybe act out in ways as far as if not to get attention for, in a way of lashing out anger at the entities that are carrying out like these raids and all of this. It then gets tied into like these well, the ends justify the means, and these are people who are at least ideologically aligned with those who want to kick out the colonizers and take our states back for Mexico. And also very similar to the kind of people, well, they don't want the Jews here and they would wipe us off if we have it. And see, it's proof that, well, the teenagers who were throwing rocks at Israeli military, oh well, they're just in the spirit of the jihadists who want to wage holy war against any Jew anywhere in the world.
Yeah. And so, deconstructing these kinds of, I mean, everybody knows reverse psychology, right? And so one of the easiest ways to control a conversation, we could even go back to Noam Chomsky, is to limit the scope of the debate, right? But even in that, Chomsky is limiting the scope of the analysis by talking about limiting the scope of the debate, because he's sort of really talking about, well, don't let it get too extreme or something to one side or the other or something like that. But I would say, the most effective way to control discourse is to frame it as two sides. And both sidesism, whataboutism, all of these kinds of things are within the realm of this kind of, I think, rhetorical falsehood. And so maybe we can just hone in on someone like Norman Finkelstein, repeating one of the things that we've almost one of the early was Greg and I were just talking about two of the earliest episodes that we produced as the antidote early in the Trump 1 years. One was about um, sort of taking down or attacking, taking down pedophilia while protecting pedophiles, the pro-Trump media, and it was all about what's now just going front and center once again. Alex Jones, waving his hands, pounding the table, crying, doing whatever he needs to do to avoid the obvious and deep questions around Trump and Epstein, for example. Okay, that was one early episode that we did. Another early episode that we did that we anticipated might anger, people across the political spectrum, especially certain maybe ideologues, was a structural comparative analysis, compare and contrast of the similar and different kinds of roles that someone like Alex Jones played on the conspiracy right with the role that someone like Noam Chomsky played on the structural left. And we pointed out that any nuanced view of history and politics takes both approaches. And that's really what deep politics is. Deep politics is not just conspiracy theory as politics or something like that. That's what Alex Jones does. It's sort of conspiracism qua politics, and so that and in a certain way that's that in a way it does take the great man theory of history to the unitary executive kind of apex to some extent, and it not only obscures, but it also, I think, intentionally disrupts the more structural analyses of politics, economy, history. um, on the other side, then you have these very pure structuralists, and it's very often um, ideologically driven, if not captured. It's sort of almost becomes what you could call crude Marxism in a certain way. And people like Noam Chomsky and then Norman Finkelstein, who's sort of his protege a little bit. Uh, Norman Finkelstein is Noam Chomsky's sort of Israel-Palestine centric protege, especially for the alternative left set and media. So it's not a coincidence, I don't think, that especially post October 7th, that Norman Finkelstein becomes really the go-to guy for not for just like sort of like anti-Zionist like Jewish circles or something like that, but really for all so-called pro-Palestinian solidarity, axis of resistance in many ways. And so, just on the surface, obviously, then you have someone who's a Jewish American, um, who's really taking up a lot of space that could very likely then be better addressed, especially in terms of more informed from the ground by the, I would call, the organic Palestinian intellectual grassroots. And so that's one thing on the surface. But the other thing that's on the surface is that, Finkelstein comes out. He was used to be a Stalinist, and we started pointing out about how that Norman Finkelstein, in his modern approach, after the launching of what we've called the clean break culture wars, which are the underlying cultural dynamics of the larger 11/9 operation, aspects of the Trump MAGA movement, the quote unquote so-called resistance to it via limited hangout controlled media, the Democratic Party, the liberal intellectuals, and all of that kind of thing. Um, so Finkelstein, remember his first analysis, his immediate analysis of October 7th was almost like a shriek of joy that this was a prison break by the oppressed, and he framed it as a return to like a Nat Turner style slave revolt. he sort of since then he then dialed that back a little bit and began to more directly focus on the the escalating Israeli crimes. Um, but I think that that original approach, and I'll just point out one last thing here, and I'll pass it back to you, Greg. But who is Finkelstein's then? Who's the Finkelstein of the next generation? I would think that it's Max Blumenthal. Now, I'm not saying that Finkelstein is Blumenthal's guru or anything like that in the same kind of way that maybe Chomsky could be considered Finkelstein's guru. But I think that they operate in a very similar kind of fashion for a little bit for different generations, a little bit for different kinds of pockets of the media discourse. But you'll see that they have actually mimic a lot of the same kind of culture war talking points, especially around things like the culture wars themselves, questions of DEI, woke politics, COVID politics in certain cases, in terms of Max Blumenthal. And what is really the main factual or, allegedly factual analytical point that they concur upon is October 7th was a fully based on a Hamas success that went over and beyond what their leadership thought that they could accomplish. And both of them have, I believe, now people can correct me if I'm wrong about Finkelstein. I've just never seen Finkelstein do any basic analysis of all the things that point to some kind of high level, all the way to the top in terms of Netanyahu's office, connivance, deep political connivance, both in the moment surrounding October 7th itself, but also over the not only the years of the support of Hamas as a political counter gang from the Netanyahu perspective, but really all the way back through, I would say, the entirety of the framing of the so-called Israel-Palestine conflict. And Max Blumenthal very almost aggressively seems to try to knock down any kind of analysis of that this was something beyond just an organic Hamas uprising of some sort.
Uh, Good point, Jeremy. And yeah, Blumenthal is very interesting because one of the things that they do, one of the things that Blumenthal, not just Blumenthal, but other people, you could say it's throughout this network of the kind of people that Blumenthal affiliates and associates with. I'd throw Jimmy Dore out there as another name. Like they, not incorrectly criticize, I don't think it's certainly not entirely incorrect, criticism of, say, the history of like, American intelligence or agencies or the CIA and all of this with like I guess like the funding of anti the funding of anti-communist causes in European countries as a way to basically kind of control the dialectics in those countries. So let's just call it for what it is. But then that is then becomes even currently now where like that legacy continues on to this day to where basically any criticism of like these civilian intelligences we were talking about on our patron chat on Thursday night, Jeremy, with some of our patrons. The nature of civilian intelligence, or of course even just the even USAID type of programs as well. Ultimately, like they'll come from the flank of, well, yeah, it's these organizations are anything that they do is the worst, and it's because anything they're doing is undermining like legitimate resistance to say Western imperial colonial policy anywhere in the world. But then the solution becomes like, I think, and certainly Finkelstein and I think Blumenthal and these types lead you into, well, the American, if the principled left would just embrace these Russia-friendly, multipolar-friendly elements that actually want to free the shackles of Western colonialism and imperialism from the rest of the world, if we would embrace that, then we could truly, really move towards a true, actual, type of society that we would all like to live in. When meanwhile, like basically Blumenthal and Finkelstein, in some ways, they act as an inverse or of Ryan Dawson's response to October 7th. And of course, Ryan Dawson is someone who is obviously not for like a type of, certainly not for even some type of like organized, like principled or whatever, even if it's under the frame of multipolar Russia, Russophilic type of resistance and establishing of something different as far as different way forward, path forward for Western countries in a more left-oriented direction. It's Ryan Dawson after October 7th saying that Israel let in these incompetent women because they fell prey to DEI and they let their intelligence and security capabilities down, and that's why this wonderful, successful attack was able to take place. So, you get led back to some of these same, in varying ways. You have these guys who are all very connected into like this. Russophilic, multipolar friendly angles, right and left respectively, that are doing different variations of the same narrative around October 7th, and that, well, this was, if it wasn't one massive intelligence failure because of the incompetent females being brought in security roles, well, they had it coming to them, or a combination of both.
Yeah, and Dawson really pushed that hard with Ritter early on. Ritter, obviously, someone who we've you know probed his background in terms of how he came to his current stance, how he met his wife, questions of honeypots, even that might be tied into the questions surrounding Epstein Maxwell network. Remember, Ritter accuses American the American security state and police elements, maybe mainly in the FBI, of trying to entrap him, of what you call digital honeypotting, maybe, right? But he also did he said what he said online, and I don't believe any of that has been denied. And so then going back to these questions of okay, what was Ritter doing toward the end of the Cold War at around the same time, by the way, that Donald Trump was making a big play into the Soviet Union. Greg and I have come across, write-ups about how aggressive Donald Trump was trying to actually get Reagan to put him to the Soviet post. But that didn't happen. But meanwhile, then Donald Trump actually did then go to the Soviet Union, and ostensibly the base layer was about these endless questions about Trump Moscow and building buildings and real estate and all of that. But underneath it all was questions of nuclear policy, so-called the so-called push for friendship and peace between the Americans and the Russians. And by the way, Ritter is actually just relaunching this whole thing. I think he's like hosted a whole new conference, I think in the United States, of Russians and Americans, grassroots getting together to to understand each other. And by the way, it turns out that basically everything is the United States' fault, and everything is Americans' Russophobic fault. And but we'll be able to figure this out if we talk to each other and stuff like that. So I'm glad that you brought up like Dawson as a good example. Maybe now Dawson would hate this, but if Max Blumenthal is the next generation of the Norman Finkelstein left, then Ryan Dawson really is the next generation of the Alex Jones right. And he would hate that because
Alex Jones and David Duke to varying extents.
that's a good point, because as much as Dawson likes to reject sort of religionism or crude racism and all of that, he really embraces what he believes looks like an academic approach to both of those things, I think. Maybe not religionism. He's very much, he fits very much into this a large portions of the old Russian sphere because of the how intensely he's almost like an anti-theist, and he prickles at religion as such, and as sort of just pure mythos and all of that. But it is the case that I think that's fairly correct, Greg, that like you could see Ryan Dawson and maybe we then lump in Nick Fuentes. Sort of Ryan Dawson and Nick Fuentes are the legacy of the Alex Jones and David Duke of the right in many ways.
Dawson, Fuentes, and Carlson, and then you could add in Candace Owens to give a little bit of more diversity to it.
Yes, and what's so interesting about all of this is, I'm trying not to be too crude in terms of the analysis, but in this case, this is an analysis that's, close to what Nancy Pelosi said is actually seemingly on the surface correct. Is all roads lead back to Putin in this case. And no matter where and we pointed this out, no matter where people stand sometimes in terms of Jewish power or Israel or Zionism or these kinds of things, you'll find organized groups on both sides of those issues that are also both feeding back in terms of dialectical warfare into long-term sort of Putin expressed, Dugin actually agitated for strategically written purposes of Russian geopolitics. And a lot of this comes to head in terms of October 7th and the post October 7th era. And, so a real, I think, then, doing another real baseline historical analysis of the background of what we now, people try to call, do we have endless Israel-Palestine conflict, or do we get the two-state solution, another weaponized dialectic? And both, I think, are of bad faith in their origins. The Israel-Palestine conflict and the two-state solution. But how did we get to this place? I do think you can see where, you know, both the Nazis and the Soviets played both sides of the what becomes the Israel-Palestine conflict, and of course, the United States and the Brits also played certain roles in certain elements of both sides of what becomes that conflict. Okay, so you really do have, like, the core of the Nazi security state, someone like Otto von Bolschwing. He ends up being a key backer, and sometimes he helps facilitate certain kinds of training of the Zionist Haganah, which really becomes the core of the Israeli military after the founding of Israel. And at the same time, the Nazis are, infamously have certain alliances with what then becomes the regional Arab resistance and all of that, and most obviously in the endlessly talked about, especially by someone like Netanyahu, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who hold Netanyahu, remember, after October 7th, said that the Mufti was more responsible for what they call the Holocaust than Hitler himself, right? And so there you have. It's very obvious that the Nazis were like, they saw that the Zionist movement could be a potential solution to what they thought was their Jewish problem, was their Jewish question could be solved by an alliance with the Nazis. So it was not just the Stern Gang and the Irgun that were seeking alliance with Hitler and the Nazis, and Stalin and the Soviets. No, it was also the other side of, the Nazis and Hitler and the Soviets and Stalin were also working both sides of the angle. And now, obviously, part of that is just crude geopolitics. At that point, they were probably both mainly interested in taking on the British. Now, of course, the British played their own role in at some point in mainly in aggressions and certain kinds of terrorist activities against the Arabs earlier on, and then eventually they then get targeted by the Zionists, and the British begin to push back a little bit against the Zionists, and around the same time the Soviets are also obviously playing both sides in terms of what we've talked about the the revelations from the Soviet Matrokin archives, which point out that Kim Philby was utilized directly by the Soviets as a key piece of making sure that the counterintelligence agitation and preparation for the King David Hotel bombing was run against the British. And basically, it looks like Philby was used to distract the British into Lebanon at the same time as the Zionist Stern Gang, aka Lehi, and the Irgun were prepping for their King David Hotel bombing, primarily against the British, but also against British Jews who were working there, who they saw as the worst kinds of traitors. Um,
Jeremy, this is a good time to remind of an article that we've talked about in the past, and that was, I believe it was the Daily Beast getting into Kim Philby as Kim Philby and Zionist terrorism and Soviet connections. And in that article, it mentions that I believe that it is believed, or it is at least believed, that this information about the nature of the relationship between the Soviet Union and these Zionist gangs are within the archives I think Vladimir Putin would have access to, and that there has been no attempt to really at least try to shed any light on any of that stuff.
exactly. And then, and just finishing that analysis, then we see then the Soviets become the Russians eventually. And so we can actually analyze it looking backward in terms of what we now know to be some of the predominant, so-called leadership of Palestinian resistance groups, such as the PLO becoming the Palestinian so-called Authority, the PFLP, and then now Hamas. And one of the earliest looked like a circumstantial weirdo kookery, like probably Ryan Dawson would try to accuse me of Alex Jones style kookery for saying this over and over, but October 7th being Vladimir Putin's birthday. And if that were alone the evidence for that there might be some kind of this might be a gift, a birthday present to Putin, then sure. But that's not it at all. There's a lot more, including that it was in the sort of year to a little bit more run up to October 7th that Hamas leadership is in Moscow speaking with them, and then what I pointed out of Hamas leadership on Arabic-speaking TV soon after October 7th, saying that Moscow is quite pleased by this. That was, I think, the phrasing of it, because that it took the American and Western eyes off of the so-called conflict in Ukraine, the so-called special military operation, the SMO, in
You could
Ukraine.
you could say the same thing with regards to the events with Israel and Iran, and Trump stepping in with the bombing of the Iranian facilities. That's very similar type of takes the eyes off of it. As a time when there are escalations on documented escalations on the Russian side over the last couple of.
And this is something that we were analyzing for a while, actually, like intensely around after the Russians invaded Ukraine on the ground. But we were talking about the alignment of the geopolitical interests of the Trump Netanyahu Putin axis, most especially. But in that case, like who was had like ongoing live fly conflicts that they were interested in giving international cover for. And it was obviously this, lingering, the Palestinian question in terms of Netanyahu's Israel, and then especially after the invasion of Ukraine by Putin, this question of, is Ukraine actually part of Greater Russia? And so we were pointing out that there's this obvious on the surface kind of alignment of concurrence of interests at the very least, which then is compounded by the actual deep political background and the relationship, and then what got rolled out after Trump used B-2 bombers to bomb Iranian nuclear sites. And I think I pointed this out in our last recording of Putin We had all these people promising us that Russia and Iran were great security partners. They just signed a long-term security deal. This is a nuttiest of conspiracy theories. These people who talk about a Russian-Israeli axis. This is worse than Alex Jones and all of that. And you'll see when the Israelis actually go to it, or the Americans go to attacking Iran, you'll see that Russia is really a dedicated, almost beyond geopolitical, but almost like an axis of resistance ideological ally to the Iranians. And then, nope, the Iranians sought some backing, and they didn't get it from Russia. It looks like, and then Putin's asked about it, and he's like, "Well, what do you want me to do?" Israel is really very Russian. You know,
You know, Jeremy. This is a very interesting what you're going down with this course here because we haven't really gotten to get into this yet in terms of our dispatches. I think maybe a little bit we touched on it in June, but this is happening where like there is this lack of, certainly it seems like on the ground or in terms of actual substance, lack at the very least effort by say the Russian government and their capabilities in terms of actually like really stepping in as far as this whole Israel-Iran escalation goes and what we saw. I mean, at least prior to the Trump declaring peace, which I think is still tenuous at best, to say the least. I think most people would probably think that. But this comes when like these, what you could call like these kind of more maybe what you call maybe Russian MAGA, or at least friendly to elements of like the Russian side of MAGA. You know, your Tucker Carlson's, your Steve Bannon's, your Alex Jones's, like your Candace Owens would fall in here. There's a number of people who would, but like they've become more openly, like directly critical of Netanyahu and the Israeli government here in terms of like blaming, in terms of like setting up kind of this schism, this next step of the schism between controlled, I think maybe schism between MAGA. How controlled it actually is, I don't know, because there's probably some very real dynamics here, but the blaming of this on Netanyahu and the Israelis, and they have all this undue control, disproportionate control, and all this and influence. But meanwhile, like actually on the ground, what are the Russians actually doing? Like in terms of the trying to do anything to really like maybe use their influence to kind of turn the tide of this at all, like what we're seeing going on. So I think that's very interesting to point out in this time as well.
yes, and this is then should be read in relationship to what we picked up on from Dugan and Dimitri Simes and Dimitri Simes Jr.'s conversation soon after the election. And this maybe it was in November or maybe early December, but we just listened carefully to what Dugan was actually saying, and he was basically laying out the Russian demands in terms of Ukraine. And that was obvious that, unless like Trump were going to totally facilitate a largely like, a partial sort of Russian military annexation of large portions of Ukraine, maybe even beyond where they are stationed right now, and then the rest of it basically a political so-called neutrality, but a Russian overseen Ukrainian rump state of some sort, then the Russians were not going to be happy. And now we sort of see that even Donald Trump's interest as a long-term made man of the Russian deep state, as we pointed out last time, not just. It's a complicated situation. He owes a lot of people a lot of different things, including not saying things like Ghislaine Maxwell, for example, about what she actually knows, what she and Epstein, even would tell certain people. You remember all these things about Epstein saying, if I said what I know now about Clinton and Trump, they would have to cancel the elections, right? So that was not just about Clinton. That was also about Trump. So Trump owes a lot of different people a lot of different things, including compromise issues that are criminal, sexually criminal, and very likely pedophilic in nature, but also in terms of how he made his way through turbulent economic times, how he built his fortune, and the massive amounts of Russian, both oligarchical and organized crime, money laundering that was run through his properties. and all of that. But Donald Trump has finally said, Putin tells me a lot of nice things. He tells us a lot of nice things, but it's ultimately he's just saying the same thing that we pointed out last time about the Israelis and the Iranians. They don't know what the f they're doing. Yeah, maybe they do know what the f they're doing. Maybe all these people do know what the f they're doing, and that's why all these kinds of spheres have cultivated you, Donald Trump, for so many years. So we pointed out that Dugin also then said in laying out the Russian demands about how Trump could so-called make peace on day one, all of that kind of thing. He also said if we don't get what we want, we have lots of possibilities that include the through our networks, basically saying proxy networks in the Middle East, we can sow chaos, right? And so we've seen good portions of that, especially maybe in terms of Syria, I think, especially the post Assad Syria and certain very Israeli, Iranian, Russian geopolitical alignment. Where we had the Israelis very directly say calling for the Russians to be brought back into Syria in order to keep it destable a little bit, push rolled back in the words of the clean break paper, and soften Syria a little bit. And so that was very direct. The Israelis were calling for the Russians to be their assets in Syria. And then even on up to these questions of using largely sort of generated inter-ethnic, inter-tribal, revanchist kinds of politics that ends up in people being killed, and the Israelis especially utilizing that as a moment to go and bomb Damascus in a way that they never did actually during Assad and the clean break destabilization war that they were toward the core of. So we've seen the actual result of that, I think, of Dugin's threats, and there's probably a lot more examples that we could uncover and lay out. But I guess my deeper point in terms of the question of weaponized dialectics when it comes to something like Hamas and Israel or the Israel-Palestine conflict and things like that is that it does become a little bit difficult to actually express yourself and your principles clearly, which is part of the reason why I think you have had this push towards do you condemn Hamas? Do you condemn Hamas? Do you condemn Hamas? As an entrance fee to sort of major public discussion and access to bigger media platforms, and a lot of people rejected giving that entrance fee, and still were able to get their voices heard. And of course, like going back to Finkelstein, who with Gianna Joy Gray, basically denied that things like targeted assassinations of the 60s really made any difference. And yet then he goes and says that this is a prison break, an organic prison break that other people, partially rightfully see as at least partially not an act of resistance only. That would be if it was, totally a military targeting, then you could say this is Palestinian, international legal resistance to their ongoing military occupation by Israel. Because even the sort of very, I would say, good faith Marxist left will point out that the Palestinians and thus Hamas have a legal right to resist a military occupation, but will then say that if there were atrocity in terms of the atrocities that were committed against civilians, then that should be then tried as war crimes, really, right? And all of that. And so while Finkelstein is denying that certain deep political actions, and remember the core of like deep political actions are usually things like assassinations, coordinated, targeted political assassinations, and then deep state sponsored terrorism, right? And we've done that. We've talked about that over and over the last decade in terms of the arc from these coordinated assassinations of the 60s in an American context to the age of terror and the terror war, and all the way, past the Jerusalem conference that Netanyahu really facilitated in 1979, through the 80s, and all of that era, all the way through to the big wedding of the so-called war on terror, September 11th, and then what I would say the sort of finishing stone, or the apex moment of, I believe, strategically, of this entire arc is October 7th, and then what it facilitates in terms of what Netanyahu's government and military is still doing to this day. Now with some Trump write-off, which is now they're really like going back to their intentional starvation, the squeezing. It's sort of a steady squeezing. It doesn't look sort of quite as brutal as blowing children into pieces that then their parents had to put in plastic bags, that they've been doing over, in over almost the last 2 years. But now it's this very steady kind of squeezing where, over 100 children die of now starvation, it looks like, on a day-to-day basis there, and so these are the kinds of events that we would call deep political events, assassinations, and terrorism. And Finkelstein seems to deny any any even reason for an analysis of these things, let alone the facts that would suggest that everywhere from the political assassinations of Black American leadership in the '60s to the assassinations of the Kennedys in the '60s, on through things like September 11th and then October 7th, could be at the core of things like deep politics, and very, very crucial in terms of the way that history turns, rather than denying the so-called great man theory that, if Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, who cares, because he was some type of Catholic capitalist, inside boy schmuck or something like that. That's the Finkelstein kind of approach on it. And so I'll just point out, it is we should do a deeper dive on this in the future, but it is very interesting that you have, Robert Kennedy assassinated by what they call a Palestinian, a disgruntled Palestinian, in Sirhan in 1968, in June of 1968. Now it turns out the forensics don't support any of that. Not that Sirhan wasn't involved, but he was very, very obviously, I would say, cultivated by a Zionist network that, of course, is a deep political network, meaning it's the conjunction of certain security elements, covert security elements that are sort of, in that case, very likely a bridge to U.S. covert security elements and Israeli covert security elements, all sort of held together in the infrastructure by organized crime and sort of like a Jewish Zionist at that point oligarchical organized crime syndicate. And that's how the Palestinian is then brought into this situation, and then framed as such, as the disgruntled Palestinian assassin of Robert Kennedy. Even though the forensics actually don't support that in terms of where did the actual death blow come from. It came from behind Robert Kennedy's ear, and Sirhan was in front. So certain things are like very obvious around certain events like that. I think that's one where it had become very obvious. But then, just like I think what 4 years later, 4 years later. A Kennedy is again then involved, is sort of then targeted for, or is involved in a hijacking by a Palestinian resistance group, the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And I forget which Kennedy it was. I said that it was Greg. Is it Robert's brother or his
Ah,
cousin? I can't remember. Oh no,
I can't.
it's his brother. It's Joseph Kennedy. So it's Robert
We'll look
Kennedy.
up details on this and add it into the notes.
Yeah, so it's Joseph Kennedy, who was RFK Jr.'s brother, who was part of a hijacking out of a Lufthansa flight from India, um, and that its destination was in West Germany, actually, but then it ultimately is landed in South Yemen. And it's the PFLP who does this, and so it's a we haven't dug into this enough to sort of say whether the Joseph Kennedy was a part of the targeting of this operation, but I'll just say that this sort of the subjection of parts of the Kennedy family to assassination, not only the assassination itself, but the experience of assassination and terrorism, right? Hijacking and all that. And you remember, this is sort of the era of the rise of what was now then called international terrorism, putting aside the fact that someone like Menachem Begin, in his conversation, like with a journalist, basically said, "Well, how does it feel to be the father of terrorism in the Middle East?" And Menachem Begin, sort of allegedly tongue in cheek, says, "The father of terrorism in the Middle East, the father of terrorism in the whole world." And so, I guess my finishing structural point is that it's in this case it's very obvious that the Soviets were very much not only involved with someone like Kim Philby in the King David Hotel bombing, but they also looked like they had their fingerprints in making sure that the Menachem Begin types themselves were allowed to be pushed into the Palestinian theater in many ways. And so I really do see that terrorism. Now we've gone over the background of how the Israelis themselves, and especially maybe like the father of the not only the Israeli state but the Israeli nuclear bomb, someone like David Ben Gurion, made certain choices at certain points to actually go with the terrorist cells that he had said that he was going to discipline after things like the King David Hotel bombing, but ultimately, normalize them, put them into the security state in his government, including someone like Yitzhak Shamir, who had been a key leader of the Stern Gang, Lehi in terms of the King David Hotel bombing. And we pointed out before that it looks like David Ben Gurion actually ends up making Yitzhak Shamir his global assassination czar right around the time of the escalation of assassinations of John Kennedy himself, when he was president and when Ben Gurion and he were butting heads and all of that. But Ben Gurion also ultimately makes sure that these people become the ascendant force in the highest levels of the Israeli government and security state, including the Likud party, and Netanyahu really taking over from Ben Gurion as the longest serving, maybe at least most important single Israeli leader in its history. But Ben Gurion made a very direct choice in the 50s to go behind the second Prime Minister Moshe Sheret's back and align himself with people like, what's his name, the eye patch guy,
Oh, Moshe Dayan.
Dayan. And now, in the future, I'll bring some quotes in from Dayan, but he basically is talking about the mad dog theory of Israel, the detonator theory of Israel, that Israel is not going to have its power because of its statecraft or its economic relations, but because it's willing to blow things up, both figuratively and literally, and then and blow things up in a way that picking up the pieces makes it advantageous against even their allies who might hold them to account for this proposal of terrorizing the West, frightening the West, that Ben Gurion throws in with what ultimately becomes like the Likud. And at the same time, I'm pointing out that a very literal weaponized dialectic is the Soviet sponsorship at a pretty high level, and a long-standing level of pushing terrorism as the organizing concept of the Israel-Palestine conflict, right? Now, the PFL, we've talked a little bit about the PLO, or even someone like, Mahmoud Abbas is, known now as at the very least, a Soviet intelligence asset. But the PFLP is also very Soviet, at the very least in ideology. But I imagine also in terms of backing. And so when you tie those kinds of pieces, like those three sort of main groups, maybe we would talk about what becomes the Palestinian Authority, the PFLP, which is a sort of more I, ideologically pure, maybe Leninist, Marxist Leninist kind of resistance group that begins to raise the profile of things such as like plane hijackings and all of that, and then on into modern Hamas, who, no matter whether you want to, condemn the Hamas as a group, let's say, or definitely in terms of, we don't want to condemn the right of the Palestinians themselves for legitimate armed resistance against their military occupiers and all of that. At the very least, if you're not going to be a Norman Finkelstein and deny all of the actual facts on the ground of how the Israeli security state somehow failed, not only on the day of, but over the years, of something like blowback, setting up Hamas as a perfect enemy to some extent. So if you're not going to deny all of that stuff, including how did two Israeli battalions get sent toward the West Bank right before October 7th? How was this this Nova rave, facilitated into the perfect position for where the failure at the in the Gaza envelope and at the border wall there was going to happen, and how the delayed response of the Israeli military was going to happen, just enough too for then the mass Hannibal directive to then be lit up, including against Israeli civilians, which then amplifies the death toll on top of Palestinian and Hamas, both military and civilian death toll, and all of that. So if you're going to deny all of that, then you can sort of like somehow avoid this obvious background of certain players, especially coming out of the Soviet sphere, desiring to facilitate a long protracted so-called conflict that is mainly organized by the rubric and concept of terrorism as a legitimate response, in terms of, if you're talking about October 7th and Hamas, because of political targeting of civilians. It's the most basic definition, I think most accurate definition of terrorism. And then obviously this terror war that Netanyahu is waging now in a genocidal fashion. And so I think that it's important to understand these kinds of rubrics. So where you don't want to deny an occupied people their legitimate right to resist, and militarily, physically, and all of that. And yet, let's actually look at what Hamas actually ends up doing, ends up facilitating. They say they're surprised by how successful October 7th was from their eyes. And then, and then Netanyahu just had this big gift dropped in his lap on Putin's birthday, that he then tells, Douglas Murray, that absent this
Yeah.
new Pearl Harbor, let's say, or let's call it absent this new 9/11, both the world sentiment and even my domestic sentiment would have not understood, let alone supported, this Nakba 2.0 that I wanted to perpetrate on the Palestinians in order to solve the so-called Palestinian problem.
So true. And I think, Jeremy, you've reminded me of a lot of deep dives that we still need to get into, such as the history of like maybe some of the facets of like groups and thinkers and networks that led to maybe the New Iranian New Horizons conference, or of the role of Avigdor Eskin in the United States in the early 80s, and that whole history that we need to do deep dives on. So I really want to keep this thread here alive here going, and I think right now this is about the perfect time to wrap up this dispatch for now. But there's a lot of areas that we several areas that we still need to do deep dives on that we hope to get into here in the coming months, that I think will add a lot to this particular topic that we focused in on today, of like these dialectics and the ways that they're used to justify or condemn events and atrocities and all that.
Okay, I agree with you, and thank you for very much for closing us with a reminder of Dugan actually as maybe the best example of exactly this weaponized dialectic that's manufactured as part of deep political warfare. In terms of Dugan as the key figure at at least some of the New Horizons conferences, which is explicitly not only anti-Zionist but also often anti-Jewish, or at the very least anti-Jewish power, as an organizing principle of it, and he's seen as the most celebrated guest internationally. And it's also there at the New Horizons conference where I caught him on a recording saying that 9/11 represented, basically it was the inverse or the opposite of the neoconservatives in the American sphere of, but basically saying the same thing, that 9/11 was represented the time of the rise of the multipolar new world or world order, and of the Russian state. And at the same time, he has also historically been deeply involved with some of the most you know uh, vicious, I religiously and I ideologically like Zionists such as Avigdor Eskin, who are part of a crew that seek to, destroy, it looks like, the Al Aqsa Mosque and rebuild the Third Temple and all of that kind of thing. So Dugan is at the epicenter of quote unquote both sides of this, alleged opposition in many ways. And so I think that's a perfect example and a perfect way to wrap this up.
Yep. Thank you as always, Jeremy, and we'll be back with more of these. Not exactly sure when, but we'll be back more very soon. We'll try to split up these dispatches and these long forms going forward. So, but I very much appreciate the conversation that we've had here now, and thank you as always.
And thank you, Greg. All right, thank you, everybody. We appreciate you. And until next time, Antidote, we are out.